Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Uncivil Law. Happy Friday. Hope you're having a reasonably positive day. Hope you're looking forward to the weekend. Hope you're looking forward to maybe getting out and about a little bit, all that good stuff. And we are here to respond to Legal Eagle's latest shift zoof, his latest contribution to the legal community, where he is exasperated by the fact the federal government exists and they have law enforcement capacity and can enforce laws and stuff. And I've only seen the 2 minute introduction to his video. I didn't watch the rest because, again, as typical, I want to share my feelings and thoughts with you live. Because I only want to have to watch this once because it hurts me because of all the problems. So we're going to respond. The first 2 minutes of this sort of cold open I saw, and then like when he does his transition, I didn't watch. So we're going to watch it together and just try to critique and comment along the way. All right, let's get started with this, whatever this is. Let's get started with this. So this is his video that he produced. This was released yesterday. The title of this video is Portland Occupied by Secret Federal Police. The word police is in scare quotes. Legal Eagle's Real Law Review. And then his description says hundreds of federal officers are disappearing. Protesters in Portland. What's going on? Disappearing. Again, when other countries disappear you, you stay disappeared. That is one of my common criticisms between what the United States federal government may be doing and other countries doing. It's like, these are the tactics of the KGB, or these are the tactics of the secret police of China, or these are the tactics of the police of Venezuela. I'm pretty sure they're not, because the main allegation was they took you off the street. They didn't read you your rights at the time, which they didn't have to. They took you off the street, took you in an unmarked van. They took you to a federal courthouse. At some point, they read you Miranda, which I don't think happens in other countries. Then you said you didn't want you wanted a lawyer, and they let you go. So this apparently is disappearing people. I feel like some of these people should go to the countries that they really like, because some of these people seem to really like the Marxist countries and more authoritarian left-leaning countries. Maybe they should go there and see how their police system works, and let me know whether or not people are being disappeared in the United States. I can't get past the description without being just no, all the no. Okay, let's listen to whatever this is.
Unidentified federal officers wearing full camouflage, jumping out of unmarked vehicles, picking up seemingly random protesters, handcuffing them, and then speeding away. This isn't George Orwell's 1984. This is America, 2020, Portland, Oregon.
Oh my God. Oh my God. The smug. I should give you a warning. I apologize. I didn't give you a sufficient disclosure warning. This video may contain amounts of smug. Maybe it's from Legal Eagle and maybe it's from me. I don't know who has more smug. We'll find out along the way. But oh my God, the smug. So much smug. This isn't Orwell's 1984. All right, first of all, Orwell's 1984, I've read quite a few times, and didn't really involve police in unmarked vehicles winding up and taking people off the street. That wasn't what 1984 was about. 1984 was about the control of information and the eternal present, which I believe was Orwell's line. It was about the fact that the state was always rewriting history, always rewriting history, so that what was true was only what was true at that moment. There was nothing except the eternal present. There is no past, there is no future, there's only eternal present. And so all the people trying to tear down all the statues and erase American history and take down names are more 1984-esque than what the federal government did. So 1984 wasn't really about secret police in unmarked vans taking people off the street. It was It was about the control of information and erasing the past. But so much smug already. Wow. 5 pounds from Torre. Thank you very much. Using the term disappeared, which is basically a synonym for murdered, is an insult to real victims and their families of evil regimes. That too, but also you just don't know what you're talking about, I think is still more an interesting point. But let's press on.
There have been over 50 straight days of protests in Portland, Oregon, sparked by the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other citizens killed by police. These protests have been mostly peaceful, but
Okay, I love this phrase, mostly peaceful, and I love what Ben Shapiro said about the phrase mostly peaceful. Using a phrase mostly peaceful, it would be like saying O.J. Simpson on the night that Nicole Brown Simpson died was mostly peaceful. After all, most of that day, he was mostly peaceful. Most of the day, he wasn't murdering anyone. So that day was, in fact, for Nicole Simpson herself, that day was mostly peaceful. Looking past to whether or not OJ did it, let's just look to Nicole. Yeah, for Nicole Simpson, the day she died was mostly peaceful. That's the wonderful thing about the phrase "mostly peaceful." It's like, yeah, most of anything is mostly peaceful. It's kind of the parts that are not peaceful that are the operative parts. Those are the parts that people care about. George Floyd, George Floyd's day was mostly peaceful. That's not the part that we're talking about. I love this phrase mostly peaceful because it has a way of completely absolving all the bad things. Like they're not important or something. Because most of the day, they weren't murdering anybody. It was mostly peaceful. And these protests, which I use those terms in quotes because it is since well devolved beyond that. Yeah, these are mostly peaceful in that same sense. They're mostly peaceful in the sense that, yes, most people are not committing crimes most of the time. But, the ongoing civic unrest is notable. $5 from Big C Burger. My favorite videos ever. I live the eagle is wrong videos. Yeah. So yes, these protests are mostly peaceful in the same sense that George Floyd's day was mostly peaceful. That's how they're mostly peaceful. Yeah. Pressing back on.
few people have committed acts of vandalism and property damage. But back in June, President Trump activated at least a dozen different law enforcement agencies to, quote, restore order during protests in Washington, D.C.
Thousands and thousands of heavily armed soldiers.
At the time, the federal government justified this show of force with vague references to D.C.'s status as not a state. But the show of force actually had little to do with D.C.'s precarious legal status. Instead,
okay, no, DC does not have a precarious legal status. DC's legal status is not precarious. DC's legal status was established by the Constitution 200 plus years ago. It has had the same status for that entire time. Now, whether or not it should change or not, I don't know, but it's not a precarious legal status. It's not like we're not quite sure what is going on with the legal status of DC. DC has had the same legal status for 200 plus years. It is a federal enclave that belongs to no state. It is under the direct control of the federal government. That's been true for, the entirety of U.S. history. DC's legal status is not precarious. It's not like on an edge of uncertainty. Okay. Let's go back. $5 from Randy Mann says thank you. Thank you, Randy Mann, for your super chat. It is, as always, appreciated. Thank you.
the response in DC was more like a dry run, a first attempt at using federal police to stop protests. Now,
it's more like a dry run. Okay, so legal over here. Let me turn down the volume just a touch. Legal over here is assuming all kinds of nefarious intent. He is just assuming the federal government, is nothing but a bad, horrible, bad, very bad act. That they are just the worst at all times, and nothing good can ever happen as a result of them. That's Legal Eagle's position. That they are just the absolute absolute worst. And that they have nothing, that this was a dry run. This is a dry run for the overtake of the country. Can't you see what's happening? It's a dry run. They're going to come into your city next. And if you're in a lot of these big cities, you're probably thinking to yourselves, oh, thank God. Please, anytime will be fine. But, oh my God. It's like, you just have to assume the worst, don't you, Mr. Eagle? Okay, fair enough.
Now, more than 100 law enforcement officers have been deployed to Portland, Oregon.
100.
And many of those officers are not identifying themselves verbally or through insignia on their uniforms. They're driving...
Okay, that's just actually factually wrong, and if Legal looked up this, he'd know. They are identified in their uniforms. Their identification is a little bit harder to see, but they are wearing patches and they are wearing identifiers. There's a whole press conference from the Department of Homeland Security, I think yesterday or the day before, about this. It's like, yes, they are identified. They have the patches for their thing on their uniform. They have an identifier for them on their, not their name, but they do have like a badge number or the equivalent of it. And the reason the Department of Homeland Security point out the reason they're doing this is because federal officers are being doxxed and their families and homes are being threatened. So they make it a little bit harder for people to figure out who they are, so they're not being doxxed as much. $20 from Django Fett. Says, not to derail, but if you're waiting on the appeal ruling of NCF versus SSS, I find the oral argument as a separate video. If not, pick the juiciest soft stick case of your choice. Thank you very much, Django. I will definitely cover the oral arguments in the case dealing with the selective service at some point in the very near future. I appreciate the super chat. But yeah, the patches are there to be seen.
Around in vehicles not marked as law enforcement, and they refuse to say who they are, even to those that they arrest. They have apparently kidnapped protesters off the...
Okay, no, kidnap is a crime, and kidnap is a... You can't just use terms like kidnap. It has a definition, and no, they are not kidnapping protesters because they're police, and they're marked as police. The word police is on their uniform. They're clearly police. They're not kidnapping. No. Using these wonderful inflammatory words. This is great.
Street and taken them to jail cells. They've gone on the offensive and they've shot protesters with kinetic impact munitions. Federal officers have also sprayed tear gas at protesters.
Okay, all right. So they look at what just happened there, right? So they's like, oh, they're firing at them with these kinetic impact munitions. So this person is holding an object above their head. Now, what is this object? I can't even tell what the object is. They're doing it like in this 1980s Kuzak holding the boombox up kind of thing, but it's not clear that it's a boombox or what it is. And so the people shoot it out of their hand because maybe it's some kind of explosive, maybe it's something that's going to be thrown. And so they shoot it out of the hand. They don't shoot the person. They seem to shoot the thing. So they were able to hit what they're looking for. Yes, they used a kinetic impact device to shoot this thing being held over this person's head, this unknown black object that might be some kind of threat to them. That's a thing that they did in a place where in a place of ongoing civic unrest. They shot this long black object out of your hand, which might be something, and shot it out of your hand because, yeah. So I don't know what you're trying to do, but, police could probably perceive that as a threat. So that seems like a reasonable course of action, that they perceive that as a reasonable threat. Lydian says, oh, come on. I mean, you tell me that you know for clearly sure what this is. I mean, we'll go back and look at it if you want. Since Lydian over here wants to comment, oh, come on. Let's see if we can find it.
Them to jail cells. They've gone on the offensive and they've shot.
All right, you tell me what that is for sure. What is that? Can you tell what that is? Because I can't tell what that is. I don't know what that is. So it seems like a reasonable thing. Or am I the Alex Jones of law channels? I'm asking that the police seem to, what is it to the police? What is it? What are they, you know? No, I don't think I'm the Alex Jones of law channels. I'm like, it's a large object being held above this person's head of unknown quality, and they shoot the thing right out of the guy's hand. What is that? I honestly can't tell. What is it? It looks like it's got some cavities in it. I can't quite tell what it is. I don't know what that is. If you guys know what that is, then, it's a big black object. Is it unreasonable to think that maybe it's some kind of explosive? Not really. I don't think it's a problem to make those kind of conclusions. $20 from Martano says, love the show. Could we do Counts versus Cedarville School District? Yes, we can. I will add it to the list. Let me do that right now so I don't forget. One moment, please. All right, good deal. I'll go back to the live stream. Yeah, maybe I can't tell what it is. If you can tell what that is, and if you can tell for sure that the police can't tell what that is, or you can't tell maybe it's an explosive, the police can't reasonably perceive that as a threat, I don't know what to tell you, man.
Protesters with kinetic impact munitions. Federal officers have also sprayed tear gas at protesters, prompting Oregon moms to form a human shield to protect people who were peacefully protesting.
Again, that word, peacefully protesting, and I do love the moms joining hands. We're the moms. We're here to protect our kids as they riot and engage in civil unrest.
They've attacked a Navy veteran who came to ask officers whether they understood the oath that they took to the U.S. Constitution, who just didn't respond like an absolute boss.
All right, so let's talk about this Navy veteran thing for just a second. All right, so I'm going to have to make some assumptions, okay? I'm going to make some assumptions, which someone on my channel recently said I'm not allowed to make assumptions. Although I like to point out that you have to make assumptions one way or another, because all we can tell is from the footage. We don't know what happened before this. We don't know what happened after this. We don't know what warnings were given. We don't know what kind of barriers are in place, right? So we all have to make assumptions. So someone recently said, your law channel should never make assumptions. I'm like, okay, if I'm not allowed to make assumptions, then my legal analysis is, I don't know. I don't know, and neither do you. Because we don't have enough information, right? If I'm not allowed to make speculation, if I'm not allowed to make guesses, then my answer is I don't know. So I'm going to now make speculations so that I can try to fill in the gaps. Let's try to figure out what's going on. All right, let's make some assumptions. All right, so this guy, this Navy veteran, appears to be fairly close to the courthouse. He appears to be fairly close to their lines. He appears to be, and based on what Legal himself said, he went up there to ask him about their oath and whether or not they know their oath, which of course they do. So I'm going to make some assumptions. I'm going to make an assumption. I'm going to make the assumption that there was some sort of marked space that says you cannot pass this space, because he seems to be coming to their lines, right? So the police have cordoned off so much space outside the courthouse as a barrier and said you cannot enter this space, which is perfectly legal for them to do as part of an ongoing police operation, right? They corner off, if the police were coming to do any kind of police operation, they would mark off an area around it and tell everyone who wants to observe or otherwise that they have to stand behind the lines. Police do this all the time, every day. It is not atypical. So I'm going to assume that was happening. I'm going to assume that he went into a zone that was marked as him not being able to be there. I'm going to assume that he was warned not to come into that area. And again, the police don't know what his intent is at the time that he arrives. So maybe his intent was, in fact, just to harangue them, but they don't know that. And so then the police respond with force because I'm going to assume that he was ordered to move. I'm going to assume the police ordered him to leave and ordered him to move because he's in a zone that he's not allowed to be because it's been marked off and cornered off as part of an ongoing police operation, which again is the kind of thing that police do all the time. So that he's been ordered to move. And so they're now trying to use force to get him to move. So now we can query whether or not the amount of force or direction of force was reasonable or not. But I'm also going to make the assumption this was not the first thing they tried. I'm going to assume they didn't try just with batons immediately, and that wasn't their first step. I'm going to assume that maybe they tried to use hands and he resisted. So I'm going to assume that this was part of an escalation of force and an escalation of force continuum. I'm going to assume that the police acted reasonably. If you want to make other assumptions other than that, go nuts. But you all have to make assumptions because all you know is what's on the tape. All you know is you see the guy standing there. All you can see from that tape is him standing there, the police whacking on him a little bit, him basically not giving an F, and then walking away as he flips him off. So you can make assumptions about what happened before that point if you want. But I'm going to make assumptions that the police acted reasonably. I'm going to make the assumption that he entered into a zone that was marked. I'm going to make the assumption that he was actively warned. I'm going to make the assumption that the police ordered him to leave. I'm going to make the assumption that they used other force other than that. And then I'm going to assume that that was part of a continuation of force. And I'm going to assume that all that was reasonable under the circumstances, which is the touchstone of the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment prevents unreasonable searches and seizures. And so I'm going to assume that the Fourth Amendment was not violated in any of this because I'm going to assume that it was reasonable based on the situation and the circumstances for all the reasons I just talked about. And if you don't like the fact I just made assumptions, I don't know what to tell you because you have to make assumptions one way or another. You could obviously assume all those things are not true. But based on the tape, the limited tape that I have, and the fact that it was so limited, because here's another reason I make the assumptions the way I did, right? One of the reasons I make the assumptions the way I did is because if it were otherwise, you would assume this person who wants to make the police look as bad as possible would bring that in, right? So it's one of those things like if you were doing this in a legal system and you were doing it in civil law, which is what we would be doing, right? If someone isn't testifying legally, you can hold it against them in civil court, not in criminal court, but in civil court. So if you want to sue the police, for example, right? You want to sue the police and someone refuses to testify, the judge will say the jury can infer the worst possible story. You can infer the worst possible set of facts because they aren't there to testify. And so they aren't there to give information. And the reason they're not there is because they don't want to tell the truth because it hurts their side. And so the judge will tell you, you can legally infer any negative fact that you want that's plausible, right? Because they're not there to testify. They're not testifying because it's going to hurt their case. So the judge will say, you can legally infer the worst possible set of facts, all right? So that's what I'm doing. I am inferring the worst possible set of facts, which is in my province as a juror. I could assume other facts, but I'm legally entitled, if I were in a criminal case and this was being presented, I'm legally entitled to infer facts in a civil case, again, mind you, not a criminal case. But if I were in a civil case as a juror, I'm legally entitled to infer the negative facts. And so I'm inferring the negative facts. Well, what are the negative facts? You didn't show me that stuff. Why? Because it wouldn't have helped the narrative, right? If they had just immediately gone to that, if he had just come with his hands up in peace, if whatever scenario you want to spin, if that had been the truth and made the police look worse, the film would reflect that. The person showing the film, because this legal himself here obviously wants to tell the story the police are bad. His agenda is not exactly hidden. What he is trying to accomplish by showing this is to show the police are bad. He's trying to fit a narrative that the police are acting. We're not even a minute and a half into this video yet. We've got a long way to go. He's trying to fit a narrative that the police are bad and doing bad things. He's trying to say, oh, look at these horrible police and the horrible things they're doing. So he's trying to show the clips that most support his case, like a good lawyer. Like a good lawyer, he's presenting the evidence that supports his case. But I, also a good lawyer, I'm like, aha. You're not presenting more tape because it doesn't help you. Other things in the tape would rebut the conclusion you're trying to reach. You're just trying to segment this little piece off and show, aren't the police a bunch of jerks? And if you showed the full context, you'd be like, oh no, the police actually acted reasonably. So why am I making assumptions? And why am I making the assumptions I'm making? I'm making assumptions because I have to, and I'm making the assumptions that I'm making because Legal Eagle is clearly directed to one side of this. He is clearly trying to prove that police are bad. And so his evidence is designed to show the police are bad. And therefore, I'm going to assume what he's not showing me, which would show me the police are not bad. Because that's a reasonable assumption. Okay? All right, there you go. Now you all understand how assumptions work and stuff like that. $5 from Chad Monroe. Unrelated, but what's your opinion of the Attorney General in St. Louis screwing with the firearm with that couple? Would that be tampering with evidence? I don't know that it's tampering with evidence, but it because the record is there. But the fact that they charged them as though it were an operative firearm when it wasn't an operative firearm, and they sort of, again, lie is one of those words I use cautiously, because lawyers present the best possible case for the reasons I just said. So the fact that they were putting the charging documents in, let's say, the most favorable light when it doesn't necessarily reflect that is part of the reason why it's okay to make assumptions the other way sometimes. Thank you. $10 from El Rojo Grand. Comparing your legal prowess to Legal Eagle is ridiculous. Why insult yourself like that? Fair. But this was a recent criticism. People were saying, because I was doing that Attorney General's lawsuit in Oregon, right, against the police, and I had to make a whole bunch of assumptions. And people are like, you shouldn't make assumptions. I'm like, here's why I have to make assumptions, and here's why I'm making the assumptions I'm making. I'm going to, the person that's writing this, in the case of a legal document, or a person who's presenting this in the case of the story, they are trying to present the story in a way that most favors their narrative. So I'm going to assume that things that they're not telling me go the other way, because if they went their way, they would mention that. We're going to assume that they're a rational actor, right? We're going to assume the Attorney General of Oregon is a rational actor. We're going to assume that they're trying to present the most favorable case to them. So we're going to assume the things that they're not telling me favor the other side, because if it favored their side, they would have mentioned it. So, okay.
All of this happened without the approval of Oregon state officials. All in all,
you don't need it. You don't need their approval to enforce federal law.
This is a chilling show of force in an allegedly free society.
Oh my God. Chilling show of force in an allegedly free society. We are free. You are free. You have a First Amendment. You do not have the right to riot and protest and engage in civil unrest. And oh my God. The chat and the comments are going to have a debate on who is more smug, me or the Eagle. Who is more smug amongst us? Because, all right.
Are we witnessing military detention of protesters?
No.
Does the federal government have authority to do this? And do protesters have the right to fight back and stand their ground against people who are not clearly identified as law enforcement?
No.
And most importantly, how worried should we all be?
And most importantly, how worried should we all be? All right, so this is as much as I watched. All right, so everything after this point, I am now watching for the first time with you. All right, I watched the cold open before. Everything after this point, I'm now watching for the first time. God help us all. All right, let's press on. Mr. Security says, police can hold a person pending investigation for 24 hours, charge or release. I'd have to double check the Supreme Court precedent, but I believe it is 72 hours, not 24. 24 is the law in many places. I believe it is the law in New York. But the U.S. Supreme Court, I believe, set the guideline or set the barrier at 72 hours, not 24. There was a U.S. Supreme Court case on exactly this point, by the way. They still have to have cause to arrest you or detain you. But that's the amount of time they have to bring you before the judge for your first hearing. So within 72 hours, they still have to have cause to arrest you, or cause to detain you. So it's not like they can just detain you for any reason, but within 72 hours, they have to bring you before a magistrate. Although the National Defense Authorization Act may have changed that, and I have to go read that, but whatever.
Hey, Legal Eagles, it's time to think like a lawyer, because there
I will think like a lawyer. I will absolutely think like a lawyer. And I know that you are here to say that the federal police, which you put in scare quotes, are bad. So I will think like a lawyer and think, oh, you are presenting the best possible case for your side, and I will address it as such.
There are reports of protesters in Portland, Oregon being disappeared by federal law enforcement.
I don't think the word disappeared means what you think it means.
Potentially operating outside of its jurisdictional limits. Now, in this episode, we're going to explain what the heck is going on in Portland. And if you're upset about what's happening, you're not alone. In fact, Oregon has already filed suit against the federal government to stop.
I've already covered that lawsuit. I think it's ridiculous. I don't think they're going to get anywhere. But then again, it's a nice circuit. So who knows what their judges might do? We'll find out, I guess.
These tactics. But let's begin at the beginning with the jurisdiction of federal law enforcement officers operating in the states. The basic questions are, which law enforcement agencies have authority over federal land and property, and under what circumstances can federal law enforcement go beyond just federal land and operate within the jurisdiction of the state? Now, Congress has the authority to create law enforcement organizations to patrol and protect areas of federal property. Violations occurring within the federal land will then be handled by federal law enforcement officers. For example, the Bureau of Land Management has the authority to undertake traditional police activities on BLM, the other BLM, lands, which include national parks, but they cannot make arrests under state laws unless they have written authorization by state or local officials. According to an
so far so good. Right, so far so good. The federal domain and the state's domain are independent. They are separate sovereigns, to use precisely the right word, and they each have their own set of laws, and they can't enforce the laws of the other without permission from the other. And Oregon, incidentally, has given permission under its state law for the federal government to enforce state law. Now, they would presumably have to do so according to state law, when that gets a little bit tricky. Whether or not they have to follow the procedure set out by state law or not is a little bit open. So, for example, Oregon state law requires the police to identify themselves. So when federal police are arresting people for state law violations in Oregon, which again they can do because Oregon law says they can, do they have to follow that part of it? Do they have to follow that procedural aspect? Because you can think of the law in two different ways. You can think of it substantively and you can think of it procedurally. And the law has both. And we've seen this before. For example, in the freedom of speech context, First Amendment context, we've seen the anti-SLAPP suits and people saying, in federal court that state law applies, and we've seen the federal courts trying to figure out whether or not it does because that's considered procedural versus substantive. So we've seen that in a different context. So you could view the authorization as global and you would follow federal procedure, or maybe you have to follow state procedure. So it's not clear that the federal government has to follow these procedural aspects, and it's not clear that they don't. It would be an interesting legal question, to be sure. But yes, they each have their own sovereignty, and they each enforce their own set of laws, and they don't enforce the other's laws without the other's permission, and they can't interfere with each other's operations, and so forth and so on. So, yeah, so far, so good.
Opinion by the Office of Legal Counsel in 2012, federal law enforcement personnel lack the authority to make arrests under state law. And remember, state law is generally the one that we think of when we think of general criminal activities, the stuff that police often arrest people under, unless that authority is expressly granted by either federal or state law. And the federal officer's exercise of authority complies with the Purpose Act, which requires that federal funds be used only for the purposes for which they were appropriated. By the way, I am deeply indebted to law professor and Lawfare contributor Steve Vladeck on this. He's on Twitter at Steve_.
Lawfare contributor. Lawfare tends to be pretty left-leaning, but okay.
Vladeck. His research saved me a ton of time putting this together, and you should really follow him if you're into national security law. So, which law enforcement agencies are active in situations like this? Well, the law enforcement response in Washington, D.C. involved many different agencies and the National Guard. And by most accounts, the D.C. response was coordinated by Attorney General Barr. Barr has legal authority to coordinate law enforcement officers who are under the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice, like the FBI and the Federal Bureau of Prisons. In contrast, the federal officers who are in Portland appear to be from the Customs and Border Protection. CBP is under the jurisdiction of the Department of Homeland Security. So let's talk about the CBP's authority in Portland. Does it have legal authority to operate in Portland? Well, yes, it probably
All right. We also have to go past this because apparently it looks like Legal Eagle is not going to cover this for some reason. Again, he doesn't want to cover unfavorable facts or unfavorable law, so we'll say that he's just doing it because of that reason. The federal law allows the federal government to reassign federal officers and also allows them to be resworn in or deputized within another agency if they need to be. So basically, they can share amongst themselves. So they can transfer Border Patrol officers to work under the auspices of another office, so they can be sworn and deputized in, right? And also, President Trump recently signed an executive order to this effect. He basically said to the maximum extent possible, you can do this. So, and also under the Anti-Insurgency Act, he can do it. He can cobble together any federal officers and he can redeploy them. So yes, they might be Customs and Border Patrol, but whether or not they're acting as Customs and Border Patrol or within the auspices of another agency is a little unclear. Yes, federal funds have to be spent in accordance with federal law, but again, the federal law allows for this kind of flexibility. It allows for funds to be retransferred and reallocated for these kinds of reasons. So far as I can tell, based on the Trump executive order, we are well within the bounds of the norm and the code and the U.S. code, which authorizes exactly this. And the president's spokesman was recently asked about this, I think yesterday or the day before, and she quoted the exact statute. I think it was 42 USC or 44 USC, something like that she quoted. But yeah, it allows you to do exactly this. So whether or not they are Border Patrol, whether they're acting as Border Patrol, yeah, okay. Let's press on.
does. The Fourth Amendment of the Constitution protects Americans from random and arbitrary stops and searches. However, these basic constitutional principles do not apply fully at the borders. At border crossings, including the ports of entry by the sea, federal authorities do not need a warrant or even suspicion of wrongdoing to justify conducting what the courts have called a, quote, routine search, such as searching luggage or a vehicle. The federal officers cannot suspend the U.S. Constitution, but the Supreme Court has given them more leeway in these activities. Federal regulations approved by the Supreme Court give the CBP authority to operate within 100 miles of any U.S., quote, external boundary. The closest international border to Portland is the Pacific Ocean, and the ocean is less than 100 miles away from Portland, which gives the CBP specific enforcement powers. This relaxation of constitutional protections within 100 miles of any external border and or an ocean has received a lot of criticism from civil libertarians, which correctly point out that the vast majority of Americans live within 100 miles of an external border. Although CBP has legal authority to enforce federal laws in Portland, they cannot enforce state laws. For example, CBP must have reasonable suspicion of...
That's not true. They can enforce state laws because the state law says they can. I'm pretty positive on that one.
an immigration violation or violation of federal law in order to pull someone over and to stop them. But of course, not surprisingly, the federal government does have authority to protect federal property and to investigate offenses against that federal property and federal land. And generally, the federal agency that's tasked with protecting federal property is the Federal Protective Service, not the CBP. But here, and perhaps in the future, Customs and Border Patrol is being authorized under 40 U.S.C. 1315, which allows the Department of Homeland Security Secretary to designate other DHS officers to backstop the Federal Protective Service. Section 1315, which was enacted over a decade ago, empowers the Department of Homeland Security to, quote, make arrests without a warrant for any offense against the United States committed in the presence of the officer or agent or for any felony cognizable under the laws of the United States.
Yeah, so that's pretty broad. Yeah, you can arrest for any offense in the United States committed in your presence or your knowledge. And yes, you can, exactly as I said, you can share amongst yourselves. You can re-deputize people. It's within the law. So yeah, he's being a very good advocate. He's being a very good lawyer in that respect. He's bringing in contrary law. He's burying it, which, you know, that's well within the bounds of a lawyer. But he's like, yeah, this is some law that I'm just going to kind of try to undersell for a minute here because it doesn't really help me. But so he's like, he starts with this really powerful punch. And he's like, oh, by the way, there's this code that directly contradicts me, but I'm gonna like try to bury the lead a little bit. So okay, I respect that.
If the officer or agent has reasonable grounds to believe that the person to be arrested has committed or is committing a felony. And under this section, unless the federal officer personally witnesses a federal crime being committed or has a reason to believe an individual committed a federal offense, the only authority under section 1315 is to investigate offenses against federal property, which again is generally the purview of the Federal Protective Services. And really here, the $64,000 question is what qualifies as an investigation of an offense against federal property. But regardless of the authorization of these regulations, they're still limited by the Constitution. In order to be able to physically stop someone, you need reasonable suspicion. And according to the Supreme Court, in order to put someone in a van and drive them away, you have to have probable cause. And here there are reports, admittedly one-sided reports coming from the protesters themselves, that it doesn't seem like the federal officers have those kind of justifications. And it also appears that the federal officers are operating pretty far away from the federal property that they've been tasked to protect and potentially.
$20 from the Surly Sasquatch. Thank you very much. Joint case of Cigar Association of America versus FDA and El Fuego Tobacco versus FDA. I will look at Cigar Association of America versus FDA. Thank you very much for your super chat.
To investigate crimes related to.
Well, we're 49 straight days into violence and destruction in Portland. So it justifies the response because violence and destruction continue.
Now, that's not to say that the protests in Portland have been entirely nonviolent. It can be the case, as it appears to be here, that there can be some people who are out rioting and committing acts of violence and vandalism, while the vast majority of people are peacefully protesting. And the thing about that is that
I, again, love that with this mostly peaceful, mostly peaceful. It's interesting how the juxtaposition works, because they're mostly peaceful protesters, because most protesters are good and not doing bad things. So by that logic, that would mean that most police are good, because there are only a couple bad apples, right? There are only a couple bad apple protesters, and there are only a couple bad apple police. So yeah, the protesters are mostly good because because the amount of protesters who are doing bad things is such a small, inconsequential procedure. But police are rotten to the core. Can't you see all the police abuse from those police officers who are going unchecked? You see how that works? I would guess that roughly. I would guess that the amount of police who are bad are probably less than the amount of protesters who are bad as a percentage, because police are trained. Now they get more attention when they mistreat people, and rightly so. But as a percentage, I'd be willing to bet the police are less bad than protesters are bad. But the police are bad, and the protesters are mostly peaceful. That's an interesting linguistic trick. That's an interesting trick. The police are bad because of their abuses, but the protesters are angels because their abuses are so far and few between. Okay, that's an interesting logical trick. Good work.
even if simple acts of vandalism did justify the use of force, and query whether that's true or not, that doesn't justify using force against the overwhelmingly...
Whether or not acts of... Did he call them simple acts of vandalism? Hold on. Did he actually use that word?
Vandalism did justify the use of force, and query whether that's true or not. Majority of people are peacefully protesting. And the thing about that is that even if simple acts of vandalism did
Wow. Simple acts of vandalism. What a great adjective, man. You know, I take it all back. Legal Eagle is the greatest lawyer of all time, because he knows how to lawyer. He knows how to lawyer, man. He knows how to lawyer. He knows how to bring in contrary evidence in a way that buries it while still mentioning it, and he knows how to use adjectives to hide the ball and to diminish importance, man. You know, he's great. Yes, these are simple acts of vandalism, not vandalism, but simple acts of vandalism diminish the importance of it. So yes, he's doing great. He's bringing contrary facts and contrary law, and he's doing a great job of burying them. This is what people don't like about lawyers, right? Because they do this. It's like, let me start off with this really strong thing, and then let me bury the lead about this other statutes. And then let me say it's the thing, but let me say that's simple. And let me say that the protests are mostly good, and not mention the police are the same thing, right? So it's all about the advocacy and how you mention certain things and the tonality and the word choice. Something to follow, man. He's got some stuff. $5 from Muhib Bakun. Muhub Bakun. Thank you for what you do. I love your format. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And $3.99 from Philly James. 1. The protesters are meat shields for criminals. That too. Oh, man. $20 from Django Fats. So the big thing I've taken away from these situations is that Congress and state assembly persons are masking or divesting their true powers of change in the hopes the voters won't hold them responsible. Yeah, that too. There's a lot going on here, but we should admire the advocacy of Legal because he still got that thing on Captain Marvel completely wrong. So I mean, as much as he tried to bend the law into a pretzel, he couldn't bend it that far. I mean, he tried, man, he tried. But this is an example of Legal actually being a very good lawyer. He's being a very good lawyer. He has built his case very carefully. He's bringing in contrary facts and contrary law, and he's doing it in a way that buries it. He's doing it in a way that diminishes it and undersells the importance. He's amplifying that as helpful and diminishing that as not helpful. And he's mentioning contrary authority, which he has to do as a lawyer. You have to mention the facts that are bad. You have to mention the law that is bad, but you don't have to do it on even terms, right? So, there you go. Simple acts of vandalism. I love that phraseology. So, yeah, the simple acts of vandalism, such as burning things and smashing windows and, setting fires and so forth and so on. Those simple acts of violations. Man. And then someone in chat comments, Victoria says, I wonder how simple the same act of vandalism will be if it was illegal Eagles property that was vandalized. Yeah, I kind of saw that the same thing when when it was the mayor of Portland's property the Chaz was great right up until the protesters come to her house and oh no, now it's got to stop. Yeah, you definitely see that.
Justify the use of force and query whether that's true or not. That doesn't justify using force against the overwhelmingly peaceful protesters of Portland and lots of other American cities.
This is a posture we intend to continue, not just in Portland, but in any of the facilities that we're responsible for around the country.
America is not under siege by protesters. And there's a concept in the First Amendment called the heckler's veto.
America's not under siege America is not under siege. Again, this is a good example of good advocacy. Changes the frame of reference, right? You change the frame of reference. So you can do this both ways. You can go smaller or you can go bigger, depending on what you need. So you can get more myopic or more macro, depending on what you need. And this guy, he says macro. So America's not under siege. Right. No one's saying they are. You changed the frame of reference on us. We were talking about Portland until about 5 seconds ago. I know the tricks, man. I know the tricks of the trade because, it's my trade.
That you are not allowed to use the violent reaction of a minority to quell the speech activity of the majority. That's a heckler's veto, and we don't want that. But you don't have to take my word for it. Let's kick it over to our correspondent in the field, Portland resident and mom in the mom wall.
Oh, it's a mom.
And my sister, Lil Legal Eagle.
Legal Eagle, we are here on a weekday. It's about 9.
Sister Sparrow with the Sister Sparrow with the Carmen Sandiego hat. Where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? I found her, guys. She's in Portland. She's wearing yellow instead of red now.
4:45 p.m. And as you can hear, we're singing dorky songs, and the moms and dads are out in the thousands. It feels very safe, actually, right now. So even though everybody has come prepared with tear gas, accoutrements, some goggles, some helmets, a lot. People are passing out water. So far, it has felt very peaceful, and everybody is singing and getting along very well. So it's been a really wonderful experience so far. The crowd has so far been very peaceful. So how this all started is a protest for Black Lives Matter, of course, spun off by...
They turned Hands Up, Please Don't Shoot Me into a song, guys. I missed the song. I missed the songification. I missed... There's that channel, Songify the News. Maybe they should take another crack at it. You know? Hands up, please don't shoot me. All right. Let's listen more from Carmen Sandiego over here.
The murder of George Floyd. And since then, here in the past 3 nights, there have been thousands of moms that have shown up to create a wall of moms. So the idea here is that all of us are in yellow. The dads are out tonight as well in orange. And the theme is...
Wait a second. So the moms are out in yellow and the dads are in orange. So that means there's a difference between the genders after all. Checkmate, libs.
We're protecting the youth that are indiscriminately and illegally being abducted, beaten, any number of things by the feds that have come into our city. So far, the night has been absolutely lovely. It's a warm, balmy evening. People have been passing out these little pig squeakers, which has been kind of delightful, very Portland.
Why would you pass out pig squeakers? Are we trying to make aspersions to the police? Oh my God. And look at the vandalism on the wall just behind her. You know, I'd like, the mostly peaceful protesters that have vandalized. Look at the streets they're painted. This thing behind her is painted. Yeah, there's been no unrest in Portland whatsoever. No reason for the police to get involved.
Of the city, and otherwise we've been singing. There have been people of color representing and speaking up on stage, and a lot of chants. So it's been a really nice night.
Thanks, little sis. Really, truly terrifying stuff. I haven't seen that kind of carnage since the Women's March of '17. Stay safe.
Well, maybe you want to, again, he's burying the facts, right? So again, he's showing the most favorable stuff to his side. He's showing them with their singing, hands up, please don't shoot me. And this stuff, but even in his selected shots, he can't avoid the fact that the properties have been vandalized. That would be vandalized, and that stuff. It's like, oh my God, I haven't seen the cards. Would you like to see some other video from Portland or since we're talking about America at large, apparently, because we changed frames of reference, should we talk about other things that are happening in other cities, or do you not want to bring in those facts because those facts are not favorable? You know, man, my eye. God. All right, let's press on.
Out there and don't get a paper cut on all those signs.
Let's stay clear! The moms are here!
So the next question naturally is, what federal laws are CBP officers trying to enforce in Portland? Unlike Washington, D.C., where there's quite a lot of federal property, Oregon really doesn't have that much property that's under the exclusive jurisdiction of the federal government. Federal law enforcement officers can arrest someone who vandalizes a federal building like a courthouse, which there are some in downtown Portland. And federal immigration authorities can arrest people for suspicion of violating immigration laws and for violating any federal law, provided the federal offense happened in the officer's presence. But federal law enforcement officers don't have the authority to enforce state laws on non-federal property.
Yes, they do.
And when you're talking about vandalism of...
Yes, they do. You could have looked this up. They do under state law. You could have checked this out. Yes, they do. Thank you for the wonderful fact research.
Non-federal property, that would clearly be a state-based law. And here, the governor of Oregon does not want federal law enforcement in her state. That leaves us with a complicated situation that's susceptible to abuse by overzealous federal officers. So are federal officers simply protecting federal courthouses from vandalism in Portland? It definitely doesn't look that way. Reports suggest that CBP officers are roaming the streets a considerable distance from federal property. For example, protester Mark Pettibone was suddenly seized by camo-clad people and thrown into an unmarked minivan. Pettibone was taken to a cell in a federal courthouse where he was asked if he would waive his rights. He answered no and was then apparently released. Pettibone wasn't...
That's apparently disappearing people. That's what we mean by disappearing. Yes, the police came, put us into a courthouse, they read us Miranda, and then they let us go. That's what it means to be disappearing people, guys. We are disappearing people in Portland as we speak. Okay.
charged with a crime. He says that the men who grabbed him did not identify themselves. CBP said that Pettibone and others who were detained were wanted for destruction of federal property or assault on federal officers. But there's been no proof of these allegations yet, though, and the fact that these people are being detained, thrown in a cell, and then released without charges makes these arrests seem pretty dubious. CBP denies that its officers are not identified. The agency told reporters that their uniforms have a CBP patch, but officers are not identified by name because they might be doxxed, which might put their lives in danger. This might strike some of you as an acceptable reason not to identify officers by name, but note that even Army soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan wear names on their uniforms, both in English and Arabic. Is the average Portland protester a greater menace than ISIS or Al-Qaeda?
At this point, quite possibly, yes. They might be a greater threat, yes.
And by the way, if you want a great breakdown between the differences between police tactics and army tactics, check out my friend Knowing Better's channel, where he talks about his experience serving in the military in Afghanistan and the differences between military and police and the overlap between the two as well. Legal commentator Ken White probably put it best: federalism, except for occupying cities and beating and detaining people on suspicion of vandalism. So now we get to the heart of the matter. Did federal LEOs violate the law?
No.
Well, let's talk about the lack of identification. Why is it bad for law enforcement to go around without identification? Well, first and foremost, a person or suspect might refuse to respond to an order from a law enforcement official who doesn't clearly identify themselves. There's also the danger that various law enforcement officers might not be able to recognize each other, especially since many different military and police groups are involved in both DC and Portland. And riot helmets often have identifying numbers on their backs, partly for this reason. But the big reason, obviously, is that if officers don't identify themselves, then they can't be held accountable for their misbehavior. This is especially egregious because the protests are directly calling for police accountability. Anonymity, it might be a good thing in war, but it's very bad when the officers are controlling demonstrations in their own country. And the precise legal question of whether it's reasonable for an officer to refuse to identify him or herself by name and state who he works for has not really been decided by federal courts. Obviously, when officers are undercover, it would—
You see that part right there, where he kind of buries that lead again. So again, he's being very good as a lawyer, and you have to pay attention to when he does things like that. You know, he's like, "Yeah, well, this issue hasn't been decided by the federal courts, but I'm going to kind of bury it. Just going to kind of mention it in a throwaway line at the end of a sentence, right? I'm just going to mention, when some of the stuff hasn't been decided by the federal courts, because yeah. So like, oh, is it illegal? Well, the courts haven't said one way or the other. I don't want to mention that, so I'm going to kind of bury it. Oh man, legal. Illegal is a great lawyer. He's still completely wrong about Captain Marvel. That is insane, but he's showing you how to be a very good lawyer right now. So all you guys who want to learn how to be lawyers, Legal Eagle is actually pretty good. He's doing what he's supposed to do. He's bringing in contrary facts and contrary authority, and he's burying it. He's mealy-mouthing it. He's throwing it away because he doesn't want to mention it. He makes these cases, and then he brings in these little rebuttals, and breaks his cases, brings in these rebuttals. I can see what's going on. It's great. I don't know why my eye is hurting so much. It's itching like crazy.
Be reasonable for them to remain anonymous. But in situations like a protest, it's vitally important for people to know that they're being stopped by police instead of by civilians. And courts have generally held that officers should identify themselves in these situations, but it's still a novel legal issue, at least from a federal standpoint. There's no federal law that requires federal law enforcement officers to wear a name tag, to wear a specific identifiable number that can be attributed to the individual officer. In part, probably because federal law enforcement has been very, very curtailed in where it can be used in the US, and it's really very recently that they are expanding outside of their clear mandate. But just because there's no—
Well, I love that. Like, again, he buries it. Oh, there's no clear reason that requires them to do this, no clear thing. Well, maybe it's because they're going outside their clear mandate. Yeah, well, federal officials have been exercising and enforcing the law, and they were doing it in the South. And you were totally cool with that. And now that they're doing it in the Northwest, you're like, oh, no. Now this is too much, right? So, yeah. Man, my eye is killing me.
Federal law that applies here doesn't mean that state law doesn't control. And while there is no federal law requiring federal officers to wear insignia identifying themselves or individual name tags, Oregon law does require any law enforcement officers purporting to enforce state law to conspicuously display an official identification card showing the officer's lawful authority. Oregon authorizes federal officers to enforce state law, but only under
Okay, that's what I said. And you earlier said no, they can't, and I'm like, yes, they can. And now you're saying now they can. So which was it? Well, I know for a fact it is that they can. But you were earlier saying they can't enforce state law. I'm like, yes, they can. And so like now you're just like, oh, they're authorized under state law to enforce state law. I'm like, yes. Thank you for finally getting there. 15 minutes into your video, and we still have 9 minutes left of this. Okay.
specific circumstances. A federal officer may arrest someone for a crime committed in the officer's presence if the person has probable cause. Under Oregon's authorization of federal law enforcement officers, a federal officer may arrest someone for a crime committed in the officer's presence if the person has probable cause. The officer informs the person to be arrested of the officer's authority and reason for the arrest, and the officer takes the arrested person to a peace officer or magistrate without delay. And there's one other legal requirement. The federal officer cannot make arrests for state criminal violations unless they receive Oregon training and are certified by the state. This tells us some important things. First, a federal CBP officer could arrest someone for a violation of Oregon state law, but only if they have probable cause. Second, the arrest is only legal if the officer tells the person the basis for their authority, who they are, and who they work for. And third, the federal officer must swiftly bring that person before a judge or magistrate so they're notified about their charges and rights. And fourth, the federal officer must be certified by the state of Oregon to make arrests pursuant to law. Which takes us to the first of many lawsuits here. Based on what we know, it doesn't seem like the federal officers in Portland can prove that they meet one or any of these conditions. Oregon Governor Kate Brown and Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler have implored DHS to remove CBP and other federal officers from the state. The Oregon Department of Justice has filed a lawsuit accusing DHS and other agencies of unlawful law enforcement. In addition to CBP, the state has identified other active law enforcement agencies as the U.S. Marshal Service and the Federal Protective Service. The failure of federal officers to identify themselves is actually one of the reasons for this lawsuit. The complaint names 10 John Doe defendants, who are just placeholders that you put in a lawsuit complaint until you know the actual identity of that person, and names the 10 Doe defendants who, quote, have made it impossible for them to be individually identified by carrying out law enforcement actions without wearing any identifying information, even so much as the agency that employs them. The lawsuit seeks a temporary restraining order to prevent federal authorities from unlawfully detaining Oregon residents like Mark Pettibone. According to the suit, Oregonians have the right to walk through downtown Portland at night and in the early hours of the morning. Ordinarily, a person exercising his right to walk through the streets of Portland who is confronted by anonymous men in military-type fatigues and ordered into an unmarked van can reasonably assume that he's being kidnapped and is the victim of a crime. This suit alleges that this is an unreasonable search and seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment, which will be repeated if the federal government is not enjoined from its activities. The complaint alleges that this activity of federal law enforcement officers violate Oregon citizens' First Amendment right to protest, since, quote, citizens who are reasonably afraid of being picked up and shoved into unmarked vans, possibly by federal officers, possibly by individuals opposed to protests, will feel compelled to stay away for their own personal safety and will therefore be unable to express themselves in the way that they have a right to do. The state attorney general alleges that the federal government did not notify or coordinate with state officers.
They're not required to.
Essentially, the state is saying that the federal government just showed up to the protests without any request from state or local authorities or training by the state. The ACLU of Oregon has also filed a lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Marshal Service. The ACLU's lawsuit seeks to block federal law enforcement from dispersing, arresting, threatening to arrest, or using physical force against journalists or legal observers. The plaintiffs in that case include the newspaper The Portland Mercury and individual journalists and legal observers who say that they were attacked by federal law enforcement. The ACLU is planning several lawsuits on behalf of protesters who say that their rights were violated, so this may be the tip of the iceberg. So, is this a constitutional crisis of the federal government against the states? Well, Governor Brown has told federal officers to get out, and President Trump said no. The federal government has officially refused the state's request to withdraw federal law enforcement from the state. The state can argue that it has certain powers reserved to it by the 10th Amendment, and while there's a real difficulty balancing governmental response to domestic crises, states generally have flexibility and authority to respond as they see the needs of their citizens. And at the same time, the federal government also has a right to respond to federal crises. The video that I did a few weeks back on Posse Comitatus and the Insurrection Act laid out some of these issues. The founders were afraid of concentrating too much power in the presidency or the federal government. And one of the checks on a tyrannical government was to give states the power to overrule the federal government during certain conflicts. And a lot of the power that we assume the federal government has might have been reserved for states because of the 10th Amendment. However, the Trump administration can counter and say that it's merely protecting federal property and that the CBP is legally permitted to help Federal Protective Service protect federal buildings. And that might effectively give the president a big personal army of more than 60,000 employees and officers. And while in the abstract, this might not be the worst thing. Of course, the federal government needs law enforcement officers to enforce federal laws. Unfortunately, we're seeing a pattern here. As we've learned over the past 3 months, the Trump administration will meet vandalism and property damage with an overwhelming show of paramilitary force against American citizens. And in DC, effectively Bill Barr, Attorney General, was in charge. But here it's the acting director of Department of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, who has not been confirmed by the Senate.
It's a Chad. I love it. It's a Chad who runs it. That's nice. That's a nice little burn there on some of the names and stuff. Yeah, Homeland Security, Chad, roughs up Portland Karens. You gotta love it, man. Sometimes when it comes together, you gotta love it.
We don't need invitations by the state mayors or state governors to do our job. We're going to do that whether they like us there or not.
And his acting deputy, Ken Cuccinelli, who's also the acting director of Citizenship and Immigration Services, CIS, has also not been confirmed by the Senate. And a federal court ruled that Cuccinelli was not lawfully appointed to his position, and therefore he lacked authority to issue several directives pertaining to immigration. But he's still on the job. And in fact, he has 2 jobs. Moreover, Mark Morgan, the acting director of CBP, also has not been confirmed by the Senate, and neither has Matthew Albence, the acting head of ICE, or his acting deputy, Derek Benner. And of course, the pattern of a mouse wanting a cookie and a glass of milk continues. Lawfare reports that an internal...
The pattern of a mouse wanting a cookie and a glass of milk? Has it... I've never heard that expression before. A mouse wanting a cookie and a glass of milk? Is that like an expression? I've never heard this. The pattern of a mouse wanting a cookie and a glass, is that a thing? Did I miss a memo? Did I miss the memo about the mouse who wants a cookie and a glass of milk? What is this?
DHS memo authorizes intelligence collection of Americans in order to protect statutes and memorials. The Department of Homeland Security says that their Intelligence and Analysis Office is, quote, collecting and reporting on various activities in the context of elevated threats targeting monuments, memorials, and statues. And it gives legal guidance concerning the, quote, expanded intelligence activities necessary to mitigate the significant threat to Homeland Security posed by such activities. Again, we're talking about statues here. The intelligence collection is authorized to prevent, quote, damage sufficient to impede the purpose or function of monuments. If you know how to impede...
Of monuments! Ha ha ha! Ha ha ha! Let me laugh in hoity-toity. The protection of monuments! Ha 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 ha! Oh, silly people with the monuments! They want the monuments protected! They want the protection of monuments! Ha 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 ha! Woo!
The purpose or function of a monument or statue, please tell me in the comments. And of course, the pattern continues again. DHS is apparently making plans to
what
impede
snide
the
comment
purpose
did
or
you ask
function
for?
Of monuments. If you know how to impede the purpose or function of a monument or statue, please tell me in the comments. And of course,
Okay. How do you impede the purpose or function of a monument? Well, we shouldn't have to think about it very hard. Well, for example, tearing it down would impede the purpose. Defacing it would defeat the purpose. If you know how to defeat the purpose of a body, please let me know in the comments. Well, tearing them down, defacing them, you know, that would be an example of something that would impede their purpose. I think Legal Eagle here wins the smug award. You know, it's unclear which of us is more smug, but I think it might be the Eagle. I think Eagle wins the smug award.
The pattern continues again. DHS is apparently making plans to send over 150 agents to Chicago
God,
for
150.
unknown reasons under unknown authority. This is obviously a very worrying trend, but thankfully there are brave souls out there willing to legally observe these protests and tell us what is happening. Thanks to them, we have video of what happened to Christopher David in Portland, who stood in front of the federal law enforcement officers and asked them about the oath that they took to the Constitution while they pummeled him and broke 2 bones in his hand, and he just stood there like a friggin' tree. And if you go out in the protest like Christopher David...
Again, the video doesn't show us everything, right? So we already had that discussion.
And the person that recorded what happened to him and want to put together the best videos you can, you should take Penny Lane's Skillshare class, Filmmaking from Home, turn found footage into a compelling video.
All right, so now we've got some ad stuff. So I guess we will dump Mr. Eagle there. So I'm not sure if that was worth anything to anybody, but you know, good times. Yeah, it's a thing, man. Oh Lord. $5 from Uncle Bob's Bees. He's an insult to Eagles, just like the Washington football team. Nice. Good times. Oh, man. Well, I guess that's the end of today's video. So for the 185 of you who are currently, 186 of you who are currently here, if you'd be so kind as to give me a like, I would appreciate it. It helps with the algorithm and helps with growth. If you've not already done so, if you would hit the little subscribe button and subscribe to the channel, that would help. And for those of you who have the button on your screen, there should be a join button somewhere there too. And for 99 cents a month, you can join the channel and help support the channel financially. So you can hit join, and that probably helps with the algorithm too. So if you would do some or all of those things, it would be super appreciated. Yeah, so we'll give it a second just to have that happen. And I really do appreciate all the support. I appreciate the super chats today. You know, when I get some support, it really helps encourage me. So I appreciate the encouragement. Thank you very much. $200. Wow, that's a very generous. It may be a record for a contribution. Thank you extremely. Wow. $200 from Django Fett. Thank you for providing equilibrium. Well, thank you, Django, for being such a strong supporter of the channel. Wow, I'm glad I waited a minute, because that is such a very generous. It may be the record for the biggest single donation I've gotten. I think I've gotten some $100 before, but $200 might be a record. So thank you very much for the $200 worth of super chat, Django. I am happy to provide some equilibrium and try to provide some balance. Thank you, David, for becoming a new member of the channel. That is appreciated. Thank you very much. Yeah, I try to call it like I see it, and I try to also expose like these little things that I can notice that you might not notice, just because it's in my trade. So I appreciate you being here and appreciate all the things. So thank you. Yeah, World War II was mostly peaceful. If you use that example, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's like world history has been mostly peaceful. Genghis Khan was probably mostly peaceful. Although with Genghis, it might be a tough race. But let's say, yeah, he was probably mostly peaceful. There are many hours of the day when he wasn't pillaging anything. So, you know, there's like, yeah, this kind of stuff. So what can you do? Anyways, I'm going to sign off for now. If you've not already done so, join my Discord. I will give you a link for that. I see that my bot finally announced my stream. Thank you, bot. You can join my Discord and hang out with me too there. That's always appreciated. So, all that stuff. So until later, my friends, hope all is well. Cheers. Goodbye.